Welcome everyone to the annual Feder Lecture. We're really delighted that you could come, and this is the first time we've paired it with the ever-popular environmental law wine tasting. So the wines are over in Westminster right now, getting chilled if they're white wines, and aging better if they're red wines for you. I'm delighted that many of you will get to meet for the first time our new Dean, Donald Tobin. It was really a cathartic experience last year. We went through a dean search at a time when a lot of schools are under pressure, and no one expected that there would be this wonderful consensus candidate that everyone would agree on. But all's well that ends well, and I'm really delighted that our new dean is Donald Tobin, and he's going to say a few words first.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. As most of you know, our environmental law program here at Maryland Carey Law is one of the best in the country. And in fact, one of the things that really impressed me about the school when I started looking at it was the absolutely incredible programs we have here at Maryland Carey Law. And the Feder Lecture, which the program organizes, is well on its way to becoming one of the great intellectually provocative events that we look forward to year after year here at Maryland Carey Law. We're lucky enough to have the Feder Lecture because of the generosity of Joel Feder and his wife, Ellen. Joel and Ellen live in Sarasota, Florida. Joel asked me to bring you his greetings and his regrets. He would love to be here today, and I think this is an event that he cherishes, but he can't be here because of his health. One of the really great things about being dean is the opportunity to meet great people. And I had the opportunity to travel to Florida to meet Joel and Ellen, and the passion for the environment that Joel has is so, so special. And he has that passion for the environment generally. He has that passion for Maryland Carey Law, and he has that passion for our students. And it's just very, very special. But he also, and part of this lecture, he cares deeply about climate change and about spreading the word about the problems that are occurring here because of climate change. So he's become an ambassador on this issue and a major, major advocate. Joel's enlightenment on this issue came several years ago after he camped for a week in the northeastern Alaska in ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And that has a strange meaning for me because as a young lawyer in Senator Sarbanes' office, I was handed that issue, and it's really the first legislative issue that I worked on. And I kept begging to be allowed to go to ANWR because I thought the environmentalists say it's the prettiest place on earth, and I should get a chance to visit just to make sure they were right. Unfortunately, I've never made it to ANWR, but Joel had, and the pristine land and the special, unique nature of ANWR really moved him. And he came back from his trip and was inspired to do a comprehensive analysis of the issues posed by drilling in the ANWR, and he shared that analysis with our students in a lecture in Professor Percival's class. And then he spoke to community groups in Sarasota and then around the country. So in no time, he had spoken to more than 2,000 people about the threat that ANWR had and the problem of climate change. Excuse me, the threat that drilling in ANWR would have and the problem of climate change. As Joel told the International Colloquium here at the law school just 2 years ago, I challenge all of us to reach out and expand our influence beyond that of our comfortable world. He believes we all have a responsibility to, as he puts it, stop mankind's express train to a world of 500 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and all of that the scenario entails. The Feder Lecture is one more attempt by Joel to spread the word. I'm so grateful for his energy, passion, and commitment on this issue, and his energy, passion, and commitment to the school and our students. Now I'll return the microphone to Bob, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks. I'm really delighted to have David Doniger here as our guest speaker. When I first moved to Washington, gosh, almost 36 years ago, David was also a young lawyer at the time. He was already here and working with NRDC, and he has played a very significant role in virtually all the major environmental controversies involving air pollution. He played a role in the negotiations that led to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, which most people would agree has been the most successful international treaty to protect the environment. So successful, in fact, that it's now being used to fight climate change and has had a huge impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Early in our relationship, David and I had lunch after he had argued the Chevron case in the U.S. Supreme Court. I had recently been a law clerk for the Supreme Court, and he was kind of picking my brain about what the court might do. Neither of us could have expected that the court would do what it did, but now we've almost come full circle, because yesterday I was at the National Federalist Society Lawyers Convention, and they had a panel of top conservative thinkers, including the former head of the Office of Legal Counsel, Chuck Cooper, who are now saying, we've got to get rid of Chevron because it can do all these wonderful things for EPA's ability to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases. David also served in the administration during the Clinton administration in top positions that allowed him to focus on Clean Air Act issues. He was involved in the landmark Massachusetts versus EPA litigation that led to the famous Supreme Court decision that is the linchpin for EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And he is the principal author of the plan that NRDC developed, which inspired EPA to do its regulations of greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. I think he's a real inspiration to our students for what you can do with a career in public service, and we're just so delighted to have him here tonight to deliver the Feder Lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, Dean. And it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about the Clean Air Act and climate change and where we've been, where I've been, and where we're going. I guess I'd like to just start for a moment. In addition to the salute to Joel Feder that the Dean just gave, I'd like to salute the work of the school's Environmental Law Clinic. It's one of the oldest and most accomplished in the nation, and clinic director Jane Barrett has had the courage to challenge politically powerful polluters. The university deserves credit for standing by the clinic, even when there's backlash from opponents. So I thought I would start by reflecting on where we are right now. This month is only half over, but it has already seen two momentous events in the long struggle over using the Clean Air Act to curb carbon pollution as driving dangerous climate change. On the one hand, the leaders of the new Republican majority in Congress are trumpeting climate denial and their determination to block President Obama's climate action plan at every turn, and in particular to block his proposed standards to put the first limits on carbon pollution from the nation's power plants that Bob mentioned. On the other hand, President Obama has signaled his determination to move ahead with more climate actions within his authority under the Clean Air Act and other current laws. And just this Tuesday, reached an historic pact with China that commits both countries to significant action and sets new targets for deeper U.S. carbon reductions by 2025. Where will this lead? Who will win? I'll offer some thoughts on the future, but let's first spend a few minutes on the nearly 50-year journey with the Clean Air Act that got us here. Our story begins way back in 1965 and 1967. I was just in high school, had no clue about what I'm about to mention. But in 1965, the congressional record shows that some congressmen were already thinking about climate change. In the debate over the Air Quality Act of 1967, one member of Congress pointed to scientific evidence that carbon dioxide from motor vehicle tailpipes could overheat the atmosphere. So roll forward to 1970, when the modern Clean Air Act was born. President Richard Nixon formed the Council on Environmental Quality and charged it to report to Congress on the nation's environment. Chapter 5 of CEQ's first annual report in 1970 was devoted to CO2-driven warming of the planet, and Congress took notice. A senator placed the global warming chapter into the congressional record. More importantly, the authors of the Clean Air Act of 1970 expressly included climate and weather in the definition of an adverse effect on public welfare. In this way, climate was built into the fundamental architecture of the 1970 Clean Air Act. You see, the far-sighted architects of the Clean Air Act built it to last. It was built not just to address the pollution problems that were on the table in 1970, but also to equip the EPA to respond when science identifies new problems rising over the horizon. So whenever the EPA administrator finds that a pollutant poses a danger to public health or welfare, including climate or weather, various standard-setting provisions of the Act place the administrator under a mandatory duty, enforceable by the likes of us, to regulate the emissions of that pollutant. And whether it's power plants, vehicles, or factories, the agency has used that authority to confront new threats like lead, fine particles, ozone-destroying chemicals, as the science has revealed their dangers. And that authority was there to be used a few decades later when the dangers of climate change really came to the fore. Now, a personal word about how I came into the picture. I first got excited about the Clean Air Act, in a geeky sort of way, in the mid-1970s at law school at UC Berkeley. At first, I was mostly interested in local and regional smog problems, vehicle emissions, toxic pollutants from factories and the like. I was lucky enough to join the staff of NRDC, and before I knew it, at the ripe old age of 33, in 1984, I found myself arguing Chevron versus NRDC before the Supreme Court. I lost 6-0. More about that in a moment. But after picking myself up off the floor, in the mid-1980s, I caught the bug for tackling more global kinds of pollution, in this case, the CFCs that deplete the ozone layer. And to make that story short, I helped use the above-mentioned endangerment provisions of the Clean Air Act. Again, the Clean Air Act, it's there for almost anything you need, to force action, EPA action on CFCs in the Reagan administration. And I worked with many others to forge the Montreal Protocol. This, as I said, amazingly took place in the Reagan and first Bush administrations. I also had a hand in shaping and starting to implement the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. In 1993, I left NRDC to serve in the Clinton years, mostly at EPA. I was privileged to be part of the administration's climate strategy team and a negotiator of the Kyoto Protocol. Well, Kyoto didn't go forward in the U.S., thanks to another denialist Republican Congress, but the seeds of progress were sown. At EPA in the late 1990s, I wrote an interagency memo cleared by my higher-ups explaining that the Clean Air Act already authorized, indeed required, EPA to curb carbon pollution if the administrator made an endangerment determination. That memo was promptly leaked to the trade press by another agency, and my boss, Administrator Carol Browner, found herself answering questions about it before a House Appropriations Committee. "I demand a legal opinion," thundered Tom DeLay, later the House Majority Leader, known as the Hammer. Browner complied, of course, and the EPA General Counsel, John Cannon, produced a legal opinion that the Clean Air Act does indeed cover the pollution that drives climate change. After Bush v. Gore, however, I needed to find another job, and I returned to NRDC to continue working on climate. And this was definitely a low point, not coming back to NRDC, but the policy situation. In the second Bush administration, EPA rescinded the Cannon memo, the Cannon legal opinion, and pronounced its view that carbon and climate lay totally outside the Clean Air Act. It would take a new law to do something about this, and they didn't favor a new law. So I helped galvanize the 15 states and 15 environmental groups that challenged this decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, which Bob referred to, and we won in the Supreme Court 5-4. Echoing my leaked memo and the Cannon legal opinion, the High Court held that the Clean Air Act does indeed cover carbon pollution, and in this case concerning cars, and EPA was obligated to act if the administrator found endangerment of health or welfare, and the court ordered EPA to make a new decision based on science and law. I'll mention here that the Supreme Court reaffirmed Massachusetts in 2001 in another case called American Electric Power versus Connecticut, which was directly about power plants. And again, in 2014, in denying cert for dozens of rear guard cases that were flying under the banner of Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA. EPA lost on one issue in that case, but it was like a 97% win. So back to our chronology. When the Obama administration came into office in 2009, the table was set for action. In his first term, the EPA and the Department of Transportation set landmark clean car and fuel economy standards, nationalizing what California and 14 states, including Maryland, had done. These will double new vehicles' miles per gallon and cut in half their carbon pollution by 2025. The President also sought, but did not get, new climate legislation. The Waxman-Markey bill would have added to the Clean Air Act a cap-and-trade program for industrial sources of carbon pollution, including power plants. The bill passed the House and had majority support in the Senate, but not the necessary 60 votes, and that left the Clean Air Act as it was. So in the second term, with a different Congress and no prospect of helpful legislation, President Obama has stepped up to the challenge of tackling climate change under the clean air and energy laws already on the books. By the way, a lot of this is spoken of as a unilateral action, executive action. To me, it's faithful execution of laws Congress already passed, already on the books. He issued his climate action plan in June 2013, and at the heart of that plan is using the Clean Air Act to put the first ever national limits on carbon pollution from existing power plants, which account for more than 2 billion tons of CO2 per year, and that's 40% of the nation's total, nothing bigger. The Clean Power Plan proposed this June will cut power plant carbon pollution an estimated 26% from 2005 levels by 2020 and 30% by 2030. It shares two key features of an innovative plan launched by NRDC in 2012. First, it sets different standards for each state, reflecting their different mix of coal and gas-fired power. Second, it establishes a flexible, system-based approach that incorporates the cleanup potential from across the electric grid, improvements at individual plants, but doesn't stop there. Using cleaner resources more than dirtier resources, ramping up zero-carbon power sources like wind and solar, and even nuclear, and ramping up energy efficiency measures that reduce how much electricity we need to generate in the first place. Already, EPA has reached out to thousands of stakeholders, from state and environmental and energy officials and power companies to environmentalists, clean energy businesses, labor, many, many others. There are many supporters and there are many detractors. And there will be a big legal fight after the rules are issued next summer over whether EPA has the authority for its plan under this particular part of the Clean Air Act, Section 111D. So here's where Chevron comes back into the fore. Chevron stands for the proposition that when laws like the Clean Air Act are crystal clear, unambiguous, the agency charged with implementing them must, of course, follow that clear meaning. But Chevron, in an important case the court decided last April, EME Homer City versus EPA. By the way, maybe you can explain to me what EME means, but that's later. Homer City and Chevron stand for another proposition. Laws like the Clean Air Act are not always crystal clear. They often use broad or ambiguous terms that, the court says, delegate to the agency the job of filling in the details or making necessary policy decisions. And where there is room for interpretation in a law's terms, the courts will defer to the implementing agency's reading if it gives a reasonable interpretation. The Homer City case emphasizes the importance of Chevron deference when dealing with Clean Air Act provisions that charge EPA with addressing and solving new problems as they arise. For these reasons, I am bullish that the courts, the D.C. Circuit, and if it goes there, the Supreme Court, will uphold EPA's interpretation of 111D and its application to power plants. Thus, the Clean Power Plan's main challenges, in my opinion, are in the political arena. And that brings me back to the momentous events of the first half of this month. In past Congresses, those who claim climate change is a hoax and those who decry a war on coal have lacked the votes to pass legislation to block action. Bills have passed the House but die in the Senate. To be sure, with a Republican Senate majority, there will be determined efforts to pass freestanding bills, budget riders, and other legislation. But I am confident that these bills will lack the necessary 60 votes, even in the new Senate. And I am also confident that if something does pass, because there are a few ways to get through on a simple majority, neither the House nor the Senate will have the two-thirds majorities required to override a presidential veto. It's possible that congressional leaders will resort to extreme tactics like attaching EPA blocking legislation to appropriations bills needed to keep the government running and daring the president to veto them. Senator McConnell, however, has already said there will be no government shutdowns or debt defaults on his watch. And while I was coming up this evening listening to NPR, Congressman Rogers, who's one of the chief appropriators in the House, said, "You never want to take a hostage you're not prepared to shoot." So Senator McConnell and others are no doubt aware of two things. One, that the American public has consistently blamed Republicans for past shutdowns. And two, that the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and curbing carbon pollution are, to his consternation, highly popular with the American public. This bears underlining. A wide range of polling in blue, purple, and even red states consistently shows strong support, usually 60 to 70%, for EPA standards to limit carbon pollution from power plants and other industries. Support levels are strong, often majorities even among Republicans, even when respondents are prompted with dire messages of economic impact. The U.S.-China agreement adds another factor. A year from now, countries will gather in Paris in another attempt to forge an international climate agreement. This agreement will succeed where others have failed if the world's largest economies and carbon polluters can agree to meaningful, mutually acceptable national commitments. Most of the major emitting countries have strong reasons to take action, but each needs to know that the other major players are in the game. The United States has not always been in the game, but President Obama's Climate Action Plan, and the power plant standards in particular, have been instrumental in convincing other countries that after all this time, the United States is finally playing, doing its part. These actions under the Clean Air Act and other existing laws have restored our credibility and our leverage, and the Chinese have taken notice. Without the Climate Action Plan, it would have been impossible for the two countries, the two giants, the world's #1 and #2 emitters, to work out the agreement announced last Tuesday. To be sure, the emission reduction commitments from these two countries, even if matched by all others, are not sufficient to protect the planet fully from unacceptable climate change. We will need faster reductions and we will work hard for them. But the journey has begun, the gridlock has been broken, the chances for a Paris agreement went way up this week. The Republicans have lashed out at the U.S.-China agreement so harshly, I think, out of frustration. They know that it moves the climate issue from the realm of mere domestic policy into the realm of foreign affairs. If your bill will undermine not only the EPA, but also U.S.-China relationships and more, you are at a double disadvantage. So call me an optimist, but I think we'll be able to keep making progress on climate change even during the next Congress. And everyone, as everyone here knows, Republicans face a daunting Senate electoral map in 2016, and they will also face a presidential year electorate, not the smaller off-year electorate that came out this year. Climate will be a bigger factor in the next election than ever before. Ultimately, our hopes lie in a return to a functional legislature, because while we can make a lot of progress under the Clean Air Act as it is, we will still need to strengthen this landmark law eventually in order to meet the challenge of climate change. In addition to having a role in some little parts of the Clean Air Act here and there, I am the author of the little-known Doniger's Law. This is the opposite of Moore's Law in the computing field. You know, every 18 months computing speed doubles. Doniger's Law states that it takes twice as long to pass each amendment to the Clean Air Act as it took the time before. Think about it. 1967, then 3 years to 1970, 7 years to 1977, 13 to 1990. The next one is due 26 years later, in 2016 or so, or maybe it'll take a little longer. But we better get that one right, because the next one after that will take about 52 years. I'm planning to stick around. How about you? So thank you very much. I'm happy.
He's prepared to take questions.
That's true.
Any thoughts on what type of, under the Clean Power Plan, I mean, I know it's still being developed, but do you have any thoughts on what type of regulatory scheme will work best?
Well, yes, actually, and we're going to work this into our comments due in December. I know the Maryland and the other states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative just filed comments earlier this week, I think, and states are beginning to send theirs in, so are other interest groups. I can assure you that ours will come in at the last minute. But I think the simplest way to think about this is that there is an emission limit for each carbon dioxide emitting power plant, not for anybody else. The simplest way to think about that emission limit is an emission rate, pounds per kilowatt hour, pounds per megawatt hour. And then the source has options on how to comply with that. It can reduce its own emissions, of course. It can do that. One of the ways EPA suggested is by making the plant generate more efficiently, so-called heat rate improvements. There are other things that can be done too, like burning a mixture of coal and natural gas in the plant, lowers the emission rate. But then the plan, the regulation, allows a range of credit mechanisms. Now, some people say, you can't regulate outside the source, outside the fence line. Well, that's not what's happening. A credit is being made, or means are being made available to create credits that count against the excess emissions of, let's say, a coal-fired power plant. You accumulate enough credits, you would be in compliance even if your emission rate is above the state's target, source's target emission rate. Where would these come from? Well, if a company chooses to ramp up a natural gas plant that it owns, or arranges for another company to ramp up the operation of a natural gas plant above its baseline emission rate, it would be generating kilowatt hours at a lower pounds per megawatt hour, a lower emission rate than the other plant, and the two can be averaged together, and that will help bring the official or the compliance emission rate of the first plant down. Same thing with credits from generating more electricity from new windmills, for example. They generate megawatt hours with no emissions, so each megawatt hour carries 0 emissions with it, and you average that together or use that as a credit with a high-emitting plant. And if the right methodology is created, you can turn energy savings into a credit for in the same way, and some people call those negawatt hours instead of megawatt hours. This is all quite simple, and it can be administered by a state, or even if EPA has to in a federal implementation plan, directly against the carbon-emitting plants. There's no need to put windmills or nuclear plants or state agencies under any specific enforceable obligation. It's the emitting plant which is under the obligation, and the other entities, if they follow protocols, can generate credits, and markets work. Now, we've had credit-based systems since the 1970s, and they're enshrined all over the Clean Air Act. And there are direct references in Section 111D to using market-based instruments. The reference sort of travels through another provision, Section 110. So I think this is a very plausible, very credible, Chevron defensible interpretation of the law. And that's the way we're going to recommend, or we already have recommended in our original plan, that the program be constructed. And I think it's quite defensible.
On the political front, do you think that if Congress gets a veto-proof majority to approve Keystone, that it would undermine U.S.'s negotiating leverage in France in negotiating an international climate deal?
Well, I'm not going to go to the dependent clause, to the second clause, because I'm going to dispute the premise. I don't think, even on Keystone, I don't think there are veto-proof majorities. The House voted today, and 161 Democrats voted against the approval. It takes 146. If you asked me yesterday for these numbers, I wouldn't know. It takes 146 to block a veto override. So even in the House, the veto can't be overridden. And
What happened after January 1st?
those numbers won't go down to 146. Even if you add, well, what would you be? You'd be changing. I would have to do that. I don't know if you double the margin that's shifted, or anyway. We'll jump off that bridge. We'll jump off that bridge when we get to it. In the Senate next week, it's nip and tuck whether they even have 60 votes to pass this, but they definitely don't have 67. While I firmly, our organization firmly opposes approving the Keystone Pipeline and these shortcuts to approve the Keystone Pipeline, we think that the political case, the political strength of the Climate Action Plan, the carbon reduction measures, is much greater. So the number of votes that the opponents will be able to muster against those will be smaller.
How vulnerable is the Clean Power Plan to congressional appropriation?
Well, yeah. So Senator McConnell has been quite open, I think, really in the first day or so after the election, in saying that he thought that the freestanding bills wouldn't pass, that the appropriations process, the riders, was the way that they could try it. And I think he used the word try, because he recognizes that, and I spoke about it in my remarks, it's hostage-taking on a grand scale. And when shutdowns when they had forced shutdowns in the past, the Republicans tend to be blamed, consistently blamed, for overreach. Why would you inflict all this pain on everybody just to take this one, to try to take a hostage on this one issue? My sister-in-law and my brother-in-law traveled all the way out to the Grand Canyon last fall for a trip they'd been planning for a very long time. And when they got there, the park was closed because the government was shut down. It didn't go over very well with people. So it's a blunt instrument, and I think that if the president vetoes an appropriations bill, the blame will lie with those who larded it up, not with him. And there's every sign that he intends to use his executive authority, his authority under the existing laws, and to defend that authority strenuously. You see that unfolding in the immigration debate now, and even on Keystone. You should check out his remarks from Burma today. I mean, it's bizarre. He's in Burma, a country which is struggling to get democracy back on its feet. And in the midst of that, he gets asked questions about the showdown with the Republicans over U.S. immigration policy and the Keystone XL pipeline. It must cause, I can never say her name, but the Burmese leader who he was, yeah, thank you, whom he was speaking with, must cause her to think, these Americans have no idea how wonderful a democracy is that they have, that they abuse it this way. They take it so much for granted. She spent years in house arrest, and I think there's an irony in the contrast between just in the setting today. So check it out tonight when you can look at the news. Other questions?
Let me just ask you about the mercury and air toxics rule. Is the court going to take it? If they do, what will its fate be?
Right. So just so a little background. So, power plants have create a lot of problems. They release sulfur, mercury, sulfur, NOx, particulate matter, mercury, several dozen other cancer-causing and toxic chemicals, and of course carbon pollution. And it's because of that. Well, I suppose maybe if you took if you had a totally rational approach, or sort of a reassessment, you could pass a new law. You might put all the power plant related provisions all in one sort of comprehensive thing, but they're all over they're spread out all over the Clean Air Act. The health-based standards for ozone, smog, and particulate matter drive a whole set of requirements under Section 110. The mercury and toxic air pollutants fall under Section 112 on hazardous air pollutants. The acid rain program is a whole title, Title 4. And the carbon provisions fall under 111D. So EPA has been working methodically after years of neglect under the previous administration to clear its backlog of requirements under the 1990 Clean Air Act, one of which was to address mercury and toxic air pollutants from power plants, and they established standards which were upheld by the D.C. Circuit. And there's one, as far as I know, one issue up before the Supreme Court, and they probably already decided what they're going to do, but we won't hear about it till Monday, right? And the question was, well, in 1990, Congress put all these pollutants directly on the list, no rulemaking needed, and Congress said to EPA, find all the major industrial sources that emit them and put them on another list, but for power plants, special deal, you got to make a determination that it's appropriate and necessary to put power plants on the list. And if you do, then you regulate them the same way as the other industries, and EPA did make that determination. The claim now in the Supreme Court is that that even though when you set the standard, you have to take costs into account in a very specially cabined way, that there's a completely free-form analysis of costs and benefits that has to take place at that appropriate and necessary stage. It's not a very plausible statutory construction, and I think the Supreme Court won't take the case. I think they may be beginning to have Clean Air Act power plant fatigue. Since the Homer City case was about power plants, the UARC case was about power plants. Come on now, enough already about power plants. Give me a rest. So we'll see.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.